Hello, and welcome to Bio 2301 Human Physiology. This week we're going to be discussing the cardiovascular system and the cardiac cycle. We're actually going to have several weeks on this concept where we reintroduce heart anatomy and just introduce again a little bit about blood and blood vessels. But then we're going to talk quite a bit about a single heartbeat, what we would call the cardiac cycle, and all that's involved in that single heartbeat, including the electrical activity. And then you'll see that we'll have detailed lectures coming on blood and blood pressure regulation. And so we're going to be visiting this topic for quite some time. So I hope you like it. This particular unit or week is objectives 43 to 47. To kind of begin, I thought I might throw in just what are the functions of our cardiovascular system. And most people would say, oh, it's all about the heart, it's all the heart. You know, the heart is a pump, and the blood vessels are what we're pumping into. But really, your cardiovascular system is all about the blood. Our cardiovascular system helps to generate a blood pressure in order to move the blood. It transports the blood. Blood is key because it's going to contain all of our vital respiratory gases as well as nutrients. Because of that functionality of transporting the blood and creating that pressure behind it, we're actually able to undergo an exchange of nutrients and waste in the most distant of our blood vessels, and that's the capillaries. And of course, through our blood vessel musculature, we're also able to regulate where the blood flow goes, so regulate blood flow as needed, so the body can prioritize the most important areas for the blood to actually travel to. And of course, think about your hands in the dead of winter. When they turn white, they did not get prioritized. Since it's all about blood, I thought we should kind of do a real quick review of blood and what it's composed of, and then we'll also do a quick review of heart anatomy. And you can also spend so much more time on it if you like, but I know you've had this material in your anatomy class. Remember that blood is an actual tissue. It's a tissue, but it also happens to be a fluid. It's the only fluid in your body that's also a tissue. But it's a connective tissue because it's living cells surrounded by a non-living matrix, which happens to be called plasma. The living cell component, if we were to take a blood sample and spin it down, centrifuge it, all of the living components, the cellular component, would actually fall to the bottom of the test tube because it's so heavy. This living component is also called the formed elements. And then the fluid component would actually rise to the top because it's not quite as dense, and that that fluid component is called plasma. Maybe something important to remember is that the formed elements are living cells, but the plasma is a non-living extracellular matrix. That's why you can sell it. So what's the blood do for us? Well, quite a bit, of course. The first thing we'll kind of mention is this whole idea of transportation. The blood can carry blood gases, respiratory gases like carbon dioxide, like oxygen, nutrients like glucose, amino acids, various lipids. It also transports our waste, and you can consider carbon dioxide a waste. Excesses are wastes. Metabolites, for example, nitrogen breakdown, that's waste. It also transports our hormones. Another big thing is regulation. Another big function is regulation. How does it regulate our body? Well, you know, a lot of people don't realize this, but our body temperature and our blood pH, all of that has to do with blood. Think about what happens when you work out and you're creating all that heat. You get red, you get flushed. Well, that's because all the blood is trying to move to the surface of the body to release that heat so that you don't overheat and start to denature proteins. We didn't think about the fact that blood is a regulator of such things, but in fact, it is. And the last thing, and certainly not the least, is protection. Our blood also transports clotting mechanism chemicals. It also transports white blood cells, all part of our immune system, and antibodies, or what we would call immunoglobulins, all transported in our bloodstream, all help us to fight infection, both general and specific infection. So we mentioned that when we do spin our blood down, you can kind of see the separation of what's involved, what's inside that blood. And those two major components are the formed elements and the plasma. So let's take a brief minute. We'll talk about the formed elements, and then we'll go to the plasma. And this is just a nice tissue slide, a blood slide, blood smear, sometimes they call it, where you can see the red blood cells here, you can see the white blood cells here, and you can see a platelet here. And all the rest of this space is all plasma. Let's see if you guys remember what red blood cells do. Did you say transport respiratory gases? You're right. White blood cells? Defense against disease, excellent. And how about platelets? Platelets are for clotting. Thrombocytes are our clotting factors. Very good. So a little bit more press on that plasma. Plasma does make up about 55% of our total blood volume, or this blood sample, same thing. Total blood volume, blood sample, 55%, sometimes up to 60%, depending. Now that plasma itself is 90% water. But the other 10% is pretty interesting. The other 10% contains those fibrous proteins that become visible when we have a blood vessel rupture or break or damage. That's the clotting process. Normally those proteins just kind of hang around in the plasma, but they're only active if we have damage. Your plasma also contains the immunoglobulins, or the antibodies that fight specific diseases, specific pathogens. We call that part of our humoral immunity because they always hang out in the humors of your body, or the fluid. There are a few respiratory gases within our plasma, just a few that are dissolved in there, not too many. We have nutrients, of course, and definitely some lipid content. Let's talk a little bit more about that formed element component. So your plasma is 55%. The formed elements, the cellular or living component, is 45% of the total blood volume, or this blood sample. If we break that down, we can actually see that there is a measure of platelets in here and leukocytes as well as erythrocytes. But what's interesting is the platelets and the white blood cells really only comprise what we call the buffy coat, or 1% of this entire blood volume. So you would kind of see that as maybe a tiny white line right here above the volume of red cells. This entire area here, this is all red blood cells, or erythrocytes. And what you might see down here, it says approximately 45% of the total blood volume is erythrocytes. That number, by the way, when we count erythrocytes, is called your hematocrit. But if you noticed, I said that the 45% of your total blood volume is erythrocytes. But up here I said the total blood volume of all the formed elements was 45%. That's not a misprint. The bulk, 99.5% usually, of our living component is red cell. There's just that one little 1%, sometimes even less, right here, that would be our leukocytes and our platelets. This is kind of an exaggerated view. Notice the numbers. In this sample, which is about a drop of blood, you would have upwards of 4 to 5 million red blood cells, but only 5 to 9,000 leukocytes and 250,000 platelets. That's a pretty tiny number compared to your 4 to 5 million red cells. Let's do a little bit more specifics on those different kinds of formed elements. Now, hopefully you remember that all of your formed elements, your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets, they all actually came from the same place. This is called a hematopoietic stem cell. Hematopoietic stem cells are found in the red marrow of your bone. They all differentiate, though, as you see, into different kinds of cells. The red cells, we're going to talk about that differentiation next week. But the red cells, called an erythrocyte, we mentioned they do function to transport the respiratory gases. Actually, they function to transport both oxygen and carbon dioxide, but not in the same place. They have a really unique design, that little kind of almost donut shaped. That actually helps to increase surface area so they can carry more respiratory gases. The leukocytes, these guys stain really dark because many of them have granules inside, and they have very unusual, they're called multilobed or bilobed nuclei. Leukocytes are more of a typical cell. They do live a long time, whereas red blood cells only live about 4 months. These do fight infections. They're your defense against disease. Many of our white blood cells do travel in the bloodstream, but so many don't. They actually just hang out in your tissues. Think about your your lymph glands. Hey, it's early here. Think about the entire lymphatic structures, all of our lymph nodes, your tonsils, your spleen. They contain lymphocytes or white blood cells that will fight infection when needed. The reason that our count is really low is, honestly, we don't like our white blood cells to get bored and go seek out things to kill and destroy and eat. So we like to keep their numbers low, but they're really good at proliferating or making more of themselves. So normally your number is around 9,000, but if you see a number of around 11,000, it means you're probably fighting an infection. Too many, and we actually could run into a cancer like leukemia. Thrombocytes or platelets are actually not whole cells. They used to be. They were part of a larger cell called a megakaryocyte. But that breaks apart into cell fragments. And so a platelet is really a cell fragment, so they also don't live very long. But these are really important to clot our blood. If there's any kind of vessel damage, any roughness in the inner lining of our blood vessel or our heart, platelets will adhere. So let's talk about that heart. So the rest of our lecture should be spent on the heart. Bit of anatomy review, and then we'll go into some new physiology for you. I wanted to throw this review up for you because I think it's sometimes nice to have just a quick refresher, since we're going to be talking about all of these structures all over again. Remember that the heart is a muscular pump about the size of an open fist. It's enclosed in the mediastinum, which is that central or medial cavity in the thorax, in the thoracic cavity. You can see the lungs on either side in their pleural cavities, and you can see that pericardial sac that surrounds the heart and some of the bases of our large or great vessels. Remember that there are some great vessels that are associated with your heart. This is an anterior outside view or external view of the heart. You can see the large auricles on the right and the left. Remember the color idea that, for example, most of the time we do talk about veins being blue, but that pulmonary artery here is also blue because of what it carries, unoxygenated blood. The apex of the heart is that anterior, that kind of inferior tip, and the coronary vessels that supply the heart muscle itself. I like to show the back of the heart, but you can actually see the entrance to that inferior vena cava here, and you can see the entrance over here on the left for all of those pulmonary veins. That's going to be carrying that oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. One other reason I like to show the back of the heart is remember that all of our coronary vessels, the vein side, the coronary veins, all converge into a single location. And that single location is here. It's called the coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus also will empty into that right atria. So to talk about the open chambers, remember that your heart is a hollow organ, and it does have 4 open chambers or open spaces. There are 2 superior chambers called the atria and 2 inferior chambers called the ventricles. Atria, if you remember, are very thin-walled because they don't have to pump very far. They simply have to pump the blood as far as a ventricle. But we do call them the receiving chambers because they're able to receive blood from all areas of the body. Our ventricles are what we call the pumping chambers. Considerably larger, much more muscular walls, considerably larger muscular walls. Because they have to be able to pump the blood over great distances. This is where our blood pressure is really going to come from. They take up most of the heart mass, and again, have that major role in creating the blood pressure that's going to move the blood throughout our body. Just a quick review, because we are going to be talking about these great vessels, and of course, later we'll have some lectures on blood pressure itself. But I thought we might do a fast review of what blood vessels are actually made of. Okay? Certainly you can do a better review if you still have your anatomy notes. But remember that in terms of blood vessels, there are 3 kinds. There are arteries, there are veins, and there are capillaries. Arteries generally carry oxygen-rich blood, but that's not always true, right? So we don't remember that as a 100% truth. One of the things we do remember as a 100% truth that have to do with arteries is the directionality of the blood flow. Arteries always, only, ever carry blood away from the heart, and that's why it's called an artery, because it's moving away from the heart. Arteries have very muscular walls. This tunica media is very, very thick. They have a great effect on vasoconstriction or vasodilation, opening or closing of that vessel. And the largest arteries will branch into the smallest arteries, and those are called arterioles, which will eventually feed these capillary beds. Veins, on the other hand, always travel in the direction of the heart. They're always going to carry blood toward the heart. And that's why they're called a vein. Sure, oftentimes, most of the time, they carry oxygen-poor blood, so we feel like we color most of them blue. But really, that's not 100% true. Think about those pulmonary veins, or even your umbilical vein. That contains oxygen-rich blood. But they both travel to the heart. Veins have very thin walls. Look at how thin this is compared to an artery. And they have a very large lumen or opening as compared to an artery as well. Remember that veins have valves because the blood pressure is so low, they need help to make sure that the blood flows in one direction only and does not pool, especially in your feet. The smallest veins are called venules, and they are what receives the blood from a capillary bed. Capillaries we always color, let's not use the word always, we most often color purple because a capillary bed is often a site of exchange of oxygen. And so we might go from oxygen rich towards oxygen poor, and we try to show that in a color change here. But do keep in mind, capillaries can be different colors depending on what they've got inside of them. So capillaries are our smallest blood vessel. They don't have the 3 tunics that our arteries and our veins have. They only have that single inner tunic called endothelium or tunica intima, and it's simple squamous epithelium so that we can easily diffuse nutrients, gases, wastes, all the things that our tissues need. So this is the primary site of exchange of nutrients, exchange of gases. Again, so tiny. I love this picture here because you can actually see the capillary network, and that capillary network kind of encompassing every square millimeter of our entire body to make sure that our tissues have all the materials that they need. So now that we know a little bit about those blood vessels again, let's talk about the great vessels that supply and drain the heart. Hopefully you remember the two largest veins. Those were the superior and inferior vena cavas. The superior vena cava drains unoxygenated blood from all areas of the body above the diaphragm into the right atria, whereas the inferior vena cava drains all areas of the body below the diaphragm into the right atria. So these are unoxygenated blood being delivered into the right side of the heart. Also, don't forget, we have the opening to the coronary sinus right here, which will also deliver that oxygen-poor blood into the right side of the heart. We also have the pulmonary trunk and arteries and the pulmonary veins. So right here you can see this would be like the trunk of the tree, and the trunk will branch into two pulmonary arteries. So it's a left one and a right one. These pulmonary arteries carry, as you see, oxygen-poor blood because it's going, still an artery, it's going away from the heart, but it's oxygen-poor from the right side. Oxygen-poor blood to the lungs where it can then become oxygenated. Note that there are 4 pulmonary veins, 1, 2, 3, 4. And these pulmonary veins are going to carry oxygen-rich blood from the lungs toward the left side of the heart, toward that left atria. And so again, veins, because they're directing to the heart, but oxygen-rich. So we're going to color them red. Recall that your aorta is the largest artery in the body, has a huge diameter, it's under great pressure, very muscular, but that aorta is going to carry oxygen-rich blood from this left ventricle out of the body, out of the heart, and then towards the entire rest of the body. The entire body, including the heart itself, will be supplied by branches of this aorta. So it's going to ascend, arch, and then begin to descend. Recall that the aorta has 3 branches, B, C, S. The brachiocephalic trunk, which will then branch into the right subclavian and right common carotid arteries to supply the right upper limb and right head. The left common carotid will supply the left head, and the left subclavian will supply the left upper limb. Now that we know the chambers and the great vessels, we can also take a look inside the heart and make sure that we remember that there are 2 sets of valves. There are 2 AV valves, the tricuspid and bicuspid, and there are 2 semilunar valves, the aortic and the pulmonary. The AV valves, or atrioventricular valves, are located between the atria and the ventricle. So a valve between the atria and the ventricle, a valve between the atria and the ventricle. The tricuspid valve has 3 valve cusps or flaps, whereas the bicuspid valve has only 2 cusps or flaps, but they're essentially the same valve. To attach to each of those valve flaps, we have tiny little tendons called chordae tendineae, and those chordae tendineae attach to the papillary muscle, which is kind of this lumpy, bumpy muscle inside that ventricular wall. How they work: blood is going to enter into, for example, let's use the right side, the right atria, and then it will flow passively through an open valve into the ventricle. Eventually the atria will contract and kind of force the rest of that blood in, but we're trying to fill these ventricles. When the ventricles get filled, you see they contract. They're going to push in, and when they push in, that forces the blood up, up, up under great pressure. Well, when the blood gets forced up underneath a valve, it causes the valve to close off in the center. And it doesn't blow back like an umbrella in the wind because it's anchored by the chordae tendineae. So our AV valves, both right and left, contract together forcefully during ventricular contraction. So whereas the AV valves prevented any kind of backflow into an atria, our semilunar valves prevent backflow into the ventricles. So we have 2 semilunar valves. We have the pulmonary at the base of the pulmonary trunk, and we have the aortic at the base of the aorta. These are little cups that tend to fill with blood, and that's what helps them to close. So during contraction, Our ventricles are contracting, pushing that blood, closing these AV valves, but pushing that blood forcefully through an open semilunar valve out that pulmonary trunk or out that aorta. Lots of force here. But when the ventricle relaxes, the blood's like, yeah, and it starts to recoil back. Nothing's pushing on it anymore. And as it recoils back, it fills the cups, which closes off the semilunar valves. So these will both close simultaneously to prevent any backflow into a ventricle, but that's actually a simultaneous closure during ventricular relaxation. Hopefully you remember this a bit well. I do want you to remember, of course, blood flow through the heart. So this is just a little slide that kind of shows you a very brief superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, coronary sinus to the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, from that right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary arteries, which will then become oxygen-rich blood within those lungs. The lungs bring that oxygen-rich blood, they'll converge it into the pulmonary veins, to the left atrium, to the bicuspid valve, to the left ventricle. From the left ventricle to the aortic semilunar valve, to the aorta, and to the rest of your body. I was never a fan of lists, and your notes certainly also show a nice long list. But I myself am a fan of just picking a place to start and then using a diagram to follow it manually. So always start all of your blood flow questions with the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the opening to the coronary sinus. That's where we begin. Yes, it is the end of the entire circuit of the body, but it is the beginning of where blood enters the heart. And so that's why we always start there. So the first, again, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, opening to the coronary sinus, and then we say second, it would be the right atria. So this is a really nice picture that you can use kind of to test yourself. So the blood will enter, here you see, here's the superior vena cava from its brachiocephalic vein branches. Brachiocephalic vein branches to the superior vena cava to the right atria. Here from the inferior vena cava through that tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, through the pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary trunk, to the right and left pulmonary arteries, to the lungs, where they will undergo exchange and become oxygen rich. From the lungs, the pulmonary veins, and the pulmonary veins around the back, you see here both entering into that left atria, through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, out the aortic semilunar valve to the aorta, and then our first three branches, B, C, S. Hopefully you noticed that those little pictures were colorized, and that's simply because we have different circuits. The pulmonary circuit here on the right side, in blue, is called the pulmonary circuit because the entire job of the right side of the heart, right atria, right ventricle, and pulmonary trunk, is simply to pump that blood to the lungs. The whole job is to pump that blood to the lungs so that it can become oxygen rich. So it's actually a very short circuit. However, the systemic circuit you see here in red is the left side of the heart. Its sole job from the left atria to the left ventricle to that aorta is to pump blood to the entire body system, to your head, to your neck, to your upper limbs, to your thorax, to your abdomen, to your lower limbs. So that systemic circuit is considerably longer, but very important. And that's why, if you recall, that left ventricle was so much thicker, because it has an awfully long circuit to pump blood through. The next thing we're going to talk about is the cardiac cycle. But I thought we might take a small break and let you kind of sink in all of that anatomy, and then we'll actually talk about the rest of this physiology objective set together.